1 Corinthians chapter 13 is probably the most famous chapter of this letter, the book of 1 Corinthians. It has within it a text describing the characteristics of love that is probably the most famous, or at least one of the most famous texts in all of the New Testament. You can find that description of love embroidered on anything from a coffee cup or framed on the walls of church buildings or homes. It is often recited at weddings, but perhaps that text, that great description of love, has been, since it is so often read just on its own, has been lost in the overall context as to the point Paul is making concerning love. The text of 1 Corinthians 13 is not just a love letter to love, as it is sometimes often thought. It is in fact a piece of the larger puzzle that began in chapter 12 and ends in chapter 14, which is overall a discussion of the miraculous gifts that the Corinthian Christians were abusing. And that is why when one reads chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians, it is often the case that the first part of the letter, or the chapter rather, is very familiar, and the very end of the letter is very familiar, but that middle portion of the chapter is often overlooked. That is the portion that deals with miracles and how love connects to miracles, and the point Paul is making about both. It is only 13 verses long, half of which are memorized and read and known by very many, but in its context, it is often a misunderstood and misused text. So let's just read the 13 verses and consider it within the context of chapter 12 and 14. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, beginning in verse 1, Paul says, "Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and have not charity, I am become as a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy, and understand all mysteries, and have all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I could remove mountains, and have not charity, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, and have not charity, it profits me nothing. Charity suffers long, and is kind. Charity envies not. Charity vaunts not itself, is not puffed up, does not behave itself unseemly, seeks not her own, is not easily provoked, thinks no evil, rejoices not in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Charity never fails, but where there be prophecies, they shall fail. Where there be tongues, they shall cease. Where there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, that which is in part shall be done away. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know, even as also I am known. And now abides faith, hope, charity, these three. But the greatest of these is charity." The word charity, as it is translated in the King James, is from the Greek word agape, or agapeos, or agape is the root word. It is the one of the commonly translated words, love, found in the Greek language. There is eros, which is the love that is shared between a husband and wife, for example. There is storge, which is the family kind of love. There is phileo, which is brotherly love, or it is the most intense and passionate kind of love. Actually, phileo and adelphos, which is the Greek word for brother, together become Philadelphia, or brotherly love. And then there is agape, which is the kind of servant love that Christ commanded of his disciples. Although, of course, phileo is commanded, as well as to storge. You have to love your mother and father, your brother and sister. A husband is supposed to eros love his wife, and she to him. But the kind of love that is described as a characteristic of divinity is agape. God is love, 1 John 4. Well, that is agape. Christ said that we are to love our neighbor. That's agape. That we should love others as he loved us. John chapter 13 through 15. That also is agape. So the kind of love that is characterized by the Christian action is agape, translated here very appropriately as charity, because what is true charity? A true sacrificial kind of charity, not one that is done simply for tax purposes, not one that is done begrudgingly, but genuine, honest, wanting to help others charity. That is the definition of agape, to give from yourself to help another. That is what God did for us when he gave of himself, gave Christ, his only begotten Son, to save us, we who are undeserving of such charity, of such grace, of such sacrificial love. And so it is translated here, and the word repeats often, charity, and that is an appropriate and very well worded translation of that word agape. Though, of course, it has been modernized in more recent Bible translations to be simply love. Love is a very vague word. I love chocolate cake. I love my wife. I love my sister. I love the Lord. And those are all different words and should be looked at differently. This word is charity. This word is sacrificial love. And Paul begins, having just finished chapter 12, which was a general discussion of miraculous gifts. Chapter 14 will be specific to tongue speaking and the assembly and their worship acts and worship service. But chapter 12, he opened this discussion with a description of the various miraculous gifts, and then transitions to chapter 13 with the end of chapter 12 being, covet earnestly the best gifts, chapter 12:31, but I show you a more excellent way. After all that Paul says to rebuke them for their misuse of these gifts, he doesn't want them to think that they should not desire to have these miraculous gifts. On the contrary, these first century Christians, need those miraculous gifts. But they need something else as well. They need something that is greater than those gifts that they needed, lacking a written down, bound in leather Bible. He says, I'll show you the more excellent thing than a gift. Though I speak, Paul speaks, with the tongue of men and of angels, if I don't have agape, charity, love, I am become like a sounding brass, a one-note horn, or a tinkling cymbal, the crash of a cymbal that has one note. Though I, Paul, could speak with all kinds of languages of men, though I could even speak a heavenly, celestial, angelic language, if I don't have love, it doesn't matter what kind of languages I can speak. You Corinthians who are obsessing over speaking in other tongues, that miracle, the ability to speak in other languages, such as Roman or Greek or Latin or Hebrew or any kind of foreign tongue of African region, all the kind of earthly languages that a person would have to study in order to learn and be able to speak fluently. It was a miraculous gift for someone who had never learned those languages to be able to speak it so fluently. If a person who had never been to Italy could suddenly speak fluent Italian, or France and suddenly speak fluent French, or go to China and suddenly speak fluent Mandarin, having never learned the language, that is a miracle. It is supernatural. It can't naturally occur. Languages have to be learned and over time. And so Paul's point is, I could speak with all kinds of languages, but it's irrelevant if I don't have agape love. I would just be speaking a one-note horn or a one-note crash of a cymbal. Though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith. These are basically the miracles that he's already listed in chapter 12. His point being, Paul, an apostle, can do all of the miracles that the Holy Spirit has divided up among you. But though I have those miracles, if I don't have love, he says, I am nothing. Not just that I have nothing, not just that I profit nothing, but that I myself am nothing. I am worthless. Paul could do all the miracles, but if Paul didn't have love, all of his miraculous ability would be irrelevant. Verse 3. Though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, lay my body down as a sacrifice for Christ, and have not love, it profits me nothing. So you have in verse 2, I am nothing, himself. In verse 3, his actions would be for nothing if he didn't have love. He could do all of the good deeds that anyone could ever do. He could give all of his goods to the poor. He could cast down his own life for Christ's sake. He could do everything that a person needs to do for others around him to say, look at the good deed he did. But if he doesn't have love, it does nothing for him. It serves no purpose. He profits nothing for it. Verse 4, and here begins that beautiful section, that description of love and those who are supposed to hold to those characteristics. Since God is agape, Christ is God, the Christian is supposed to be like Christ, therefore I am supposed to be these things. God is suffering long. God is kind. God does not envy. God does not vaunt himself. God is not puffed up. Christ is God. Therefore Christ suffers long. Christ is kind, and so forth. The Christian is supposed to be like Christ. Therefore the Christian, he says, is supposed to, Verse 4, suffer long, that is to say, be patient. The Christian is supposed to be kind, that is, pleasant in his demeanor. The Christian is not supposed to envy, not be obsessed with someone else's success to the point where you wish you had it and not them. Love, Christians are not to vaunt themselves, not be boastful or arrogant or obnoxious in their opinion of themselves. Christians are not to be puffed up, arrogant, prideful, conceited. Verse 5, love does not, therefore the Christian does not behave himself unseemly, is not lewd or crude, does not seek his own, is not ambitious to the point of hurting someone else so that he might climb the ladder, not selfish, if you will, is not easily provoked, that is to say, he's meek, he is calm, restrained, under control, not quick to fight, quick to anger, quick to fly off the handle, does not think any evil, thinks no evil, holds no grudges, presumes the best in somebody. Verse 6, love, the Christian who loves, rejoices not in iniquity, does not take pleasure in an injustice, but rather rejoices in the truth, celebrates righteousness. Verse 7, bears all things, he keeps on going, doesn't quit, doesn't give up when the going gets tough, believes all things, gives the benefit of the doubt, doesn't assume a person means evil, has evil intent, but rather is innocent until proven guilty. Gives the benefit of the doubt. Bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, looks for the good in everything, sees the positive outlook, looks for the silver lining in everything. Those are all very similar, the words, the descriptions that he's giving here in verse 7. Believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things, has spiritual stamina, will endure no matter what the obstacle is. Again, very similar to bear all things. These are all very similar. One very naturally flows into the other. Verse 8, charity, love, never fails. Remember that. Love never fails. The word fail means has an expiration date. It will never expire. It will never taper off and just fizzle away. Love will never fizzle away. Love will never die. But where there are prophecies, they shall fail. What are prophecies? But a miraculous gift, as we talked about in chapter 12, a forthtelling or a foretelling by inspiration. They shall fail. Where there be tongues, tongue speaking, speaking a language you never learned, that is to say, a miracle, these miraculous gifts, that gift will cease. It will have a stopping point. Where there is knowledge, miraculous knowledge, the kind that you don't learn and be able to repeat, but rather you have given to you by inspiration, that kind of knowledge, it will vanish away. Those words are all synonymous. Fail, cease, vanish away. Versus love, he says, will not vanish away, will not cease, will not fail. Verse 9, because we know in part. We know, or we prophesy, or we speak in tongues. We do these miracles in a temporary setting. These miraculous gifts are available, but for a limited time, in part, in a temporary time period. We know in part, we prophesy in part. But when that which is complete is come, completed revelation, the completed Word of God, then that which is in part will be done away with. The perfect that is coming is not Christ, because he immediately ties it to the in part, the temporary, which is miracles. So it's the opposite of the miraculous, which is the completed revelation, the miraculously inspired Word. Not Christ, because if that were Christ, he says, when Christ has come, then the miracles will be done away, which means miracles would still be happening today. But you can't find anybody who has the kind of miraculous power that could move a mountain. You can't find anybody who has the miraculous power to raise the dead. You can't find anybody today who can strike someone blind, or who can give someone who is deaf the ability to hear miraculously, instantly. You can't find anybody who can touch somebody and who is unable to walk and give them the power to walk. Oh, you can find liars, you can find con men who could deceive, who could trick, who could put on a show and make you think they have power, just like Simon the con man of Acts chapter 8, but they have no actual power. They can't prove their power when push comes to shove, as the apostles could and did. You can't find someone who can prophesy and have those prophecies be specific and exact and come true, or speak in a language they never learned. all of which are supernatural phenomena. They are miraculous events, miraculous things that these first century Christians had and needed in order to preach and teach a message which was, up to that point, unwritten. But he says, when the completed word is come, when that which is complete is come, that which is temporary, see the opposite, will be done away with. It will vanish away. It will cease. It will fail. When I was, and now he gives an illustration to explain that, when I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought like a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. When I was a child, I played with toys. I played with action figures. I sat on Saturday morning, on the floor on Saturday morning and watched cartoons eating a big bowl of cereal. But when I'm a man, I have different responsibilities. I live a different kind of life. I do different things. I put away childish things. His illustration explains the meaning behind the text. He says, you have these miraculous gifts, but when the completed word comes, you'll set aside the miraculous gifts. You won't need the miraculous gifts anymore. Because now we see through a glass, a mirror, darkly, but then face to face. Right now, you could look through, let's use the example of a photograph. You have a loved one that you can see on a photograph. Later, you can see that loved one in person, in the flesh, face to face. Which is greater? They're both your loved one, but one is in the flesh. One is just a picture. Right now, in the first century, he says, we're looking at a photograph, but later we'll see them face to face. That is, to use the illustration of miracles versus the completed word. But then shall I know, even as also I am known. That is to say, I, the Christian, just as I have always known, Paul. Me, I will have the kind of knowledge that Paul has. That is to say, the inspired word will be finished. Paul, who has it in his mind, it will all be written down for me to have, bound in leather. Verse 13, last verse, the famous verse of the chapter. And now abides, now presently is faith, hope, and love. These three, but the greatest of these is love. You have in this chapter four things that Paul describes. He talks about love, faith, hope, and miracles. All at one point or another. Faith and hope he mentions in verse 13. Miracles, of course, are in the middle part of the chapter. Love is at the beginning of the chapter. Love, faith, hope, and miracles. Miracles, faith, hope, and love. Whatever order you want to put them in. Those are the four things that he talks about in this chapter. Of those four things, he says the greatest of these, chapter 13, is love. Why is love the greatest? He tells you in this chapter. The key of the verse, of the text rather, is verse 8. Love never fails. Love has no expiration date. Love has no ending point. You have four things. Miracles, faith, hope, and love. First century, the end of the first century, and to the end of time. Miracles will cease at the end of the first century, or thereabouts. Why will miracles cease at the end of the first century? Because at the end of the first century, John will write 1st, 2nd, 3rd John and Revelation, the last books written in the New Testament. After he writes Revelation, he finishes putting pen to paper. The inspired writing of God, the inspired Word of God is complete. Christians will have everything they need to know about what they need to know about how to get to heaven. There'll be no more need for miracles once the Word is completed. That's what he says in chapter 13, verse 10. When that which is completed is come, then that which is temporary, those tongues that will cease, that knowledge that will fail, that prophesying that will vanish away, they will do just that. So miracles will end by the end of the first century or thereabouts, when everyone on whom the apostles laid hands dies out by the end of the first century or shortly thereafter. Because it was only an apostle who has the ability to bestow on another a miraculous gift. If I am given a miracle, or the ability to do miracles by an apostle, I can't pass on that ability to someone else. That power was given only to the 12 apostles. The 12 apostles who all had died by the end of the first century. Therefore, everyone on whom they laid hands to do miracles, that's Acts chapter 8, and the people of Samaria on whom Peter and John laid hands. Once all of the people that the apostles laid hands on who could do miracles also died, then there are no more miracles. All that is left after the first century is faith, hope, and love. Those three. Why is love the greatest? Because faith and hope will also end. Faith and hope will also have an expiration date. When will theirs come? At the end of the time. At the end of time. At the end of all things when the Lord returns. When I, the Christian who has faith and hope, goes to heaven, I won't have faith anymore. Because what is faith? Hebrews 11:1, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Once I'm in heaven, my faith is realized. I won't need faith anymore. I don't have to hold on to faith because it's come to fruition. What is hope? Hope is the longing for something you don't have yet, based on the knowledge that you will have it. Will I long for heaven? I hope for heaven because I know I'm going to receive it someday. But once I'm in heaven, that hope will have fulfilled its purpose. That hope will have done its job. So once I'm in heaven, miracles will have ceased. Faith and hope will have ceased. All that remains is love, the greatest of these, which goes on into the unending forever. Love. You won't need to have miracles in heaven. You won't need to hope in heaven. You won't need to have faith in heaven. But you will love in heaven. You will love forever and ever and ever and for all of eternity. You'll be loving the Father, the Son, the Spirit, your brethren. You will just love forever and ever. Thus, love is the greatest because unlike faith, hope, and miracles, love never fails. 1 Corinthians 13:8. He never says in this text or anywhere else, hope never fails. He never says faith never fails. He never says miracles never fail. They all have expiration dates, but love never fails. Now, that beautiful chapter, put back in this context, makes a little more sense. People who are familiar with chapter 13 are really familiar with the first part of it, the discussion about love. They're familiar with the last verse of it, but they kind of are unfamiliar with that middle portion that describes the miraculous gifts. Back in this context, it makes sense what Paul is doing here. You have a group of brethren who are fighting over the miraculous gifts and dozens of other problems, 16 total in this book. And Paul says the actual problem that you need to solve, that will solve every other problem you have, is a lack of love. If you start loving, everything else falls into place. You won't fight over these miraculous gifts anymore because you'll love forever and ever. So, when we pick up chapter 14 next week, we will continue this discussion of miracles, one that will focus more exclusively on tongue speaking, but will also transition into the larger problem of their general assembling together and the problems that arose with that. Until then, we'll see you next week.